I would like, first of all, to congratulate the Center for Sustainable Road Freight for hosting this seminar on a very, very timely topic, decarbonizing freight transport in emerging economies. I also would like to thank the scientific committee for putting together what is no doubt going to turn out to be a very insightful and fruitful discussion and presentations of the latest thinking on the subject. So I start the presentation by making reference to the seminal paper by Wisner and York in 1964, in which they referred to a dilemma similar to the challenge of decarbonizing freight transport. And that had to do with the nuclear arms race at the time. And their conclusion, after an analysis of the situation, was that there was no technical solution for the nuclear arms race. And this was not to discount the impact that science and technology could have on solving the problem, but rather because of the nature of the problem, a combination of technical solutions coming from science and technology, but also policy, governance, institutional solutions were required to solve this problem. And this has become synonymous with the concept of the tragedy of the commons. And many of the world's challenges of today, including the excessive population growth, depletion of natural resources, but in this case, the reduction in greenhouse gas emissions and decarbonizing the transport sector can be classified under the problems that do not have a purely technical or scientific solution. And especially is this the case in emerging economies. First and foremost, the logistics systems in many of the developing countries are extremely fragmented and inefficient. The picture on the left-hand side was taken in July during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, and this was at the border crossing between Uganda and Kenya. That border crossing has always been inefficient, riddled with a lot of inefficiencies, red tape and bureaucracy, but especially during the COVID-19 pandemic, Uganda locked the borders and there was a queue of trucks 60 kilometers long. This dilemma just exposed what was already an inefficient and fragmented logistics industry, in which the industry is mostly unregulated, mostly supported by a fleet of one man and his truck, and in a sense, completely not set up for the decarbonizing agenda. Also, in many emerging economies, there are huge infrastructure gaps without which it's impossible to even talk about reducing CO2 emissions from the transport sector. The picture on the top left-hand corner was taken from a vessel in Vietnam. Many of these vessels are several decades old, leaking fuel, extremely inefficient in their use of energy. And this is typical of many of the inland waterway systems around the world. The next two pictures are actually typical of what you see in many rail sectors around the emerging economies. Railway systems that used to anchor the freight transport systems of their countries are now completely collapsed. The assets have not been maintained properly and in a state of disrepair that requires significant amount of investments if they are to be part of an agenda of decarbonizing the transport sector. By contrast, you see on the right-hand side, top right-hand side, what is also a common phenomenon in many developing countries of stranded asset risk, in which you have new container terminals, new ports or inland systems that are underutilized, as is exemplified from this one on the right-hand side that was taken from the port of Haldia in East India. And then, as if it's not as if it's not enough to see the inefficiencies that exist in the freight transport systems within the countries. The gateways for exiting the countries are extremely inefficient. Not only the border infrastructure and facilities for trade facilitation, but also the port facilities. So in the top right-hand corner, you see there the situation in the port of Paradip. Over 10,000 trucks, most of them very, very efficient, are parked outside the port, and it takes them days just to get into the port facilities and get processing and eventually get pickup cargo that has either been imported or exported. And this is not unique to South Asia and to Africa. On the top left-hand corner, we see the situation in the port of Shanghai, the busiest port in the world, but in most of the accesses to the port systems in the hinterland are completely clogged. And so when we talk about decarbonizing transport in developing countries, a key challenge is how you manage the logistics and transport connectivity challenges within the countries, but also the gateways out of the countries. This is extremely inefficient. And to add to this challenge is the multiple visions of connectivity and logistics in the developing countries. Across Africa, there is the grand dream of having a system of highways and railway networks that connect the whole continent, and all sorts of trade and regional integration treaties that have been signed. This is true in Africa, in Latin America, in the whole of Central Asia, and more recently with the Belt and Road Initiative. The challenge is that there is currently no organizing framework to tackle in a multilateral way these challenges of decarbonizing transport and reducing or managing logistics much more efficiently. But at the heart of it is actually what was referred to in the World Development Report of 2009, published by the World Bank, which made reference to reshaping economic geography. And essentially, at the heart of the challenge for decarbonizing transport is the way that economic activities within nations and in regions are organized. And for many developing countries, the few small landlocked countries or a number of countries want to tackle the various logistics, environmental, and development challenges as individual units. And the main thesis of the World Development Report was that small countries would be better off or achieve much better development outcomes if they took advantage of their proximity to countries with high economic density. This was obviously a very controversial conclusion at the time, but it is true and has an implications for the way that logistics is organized in many developing countries. Since 2009, a number of other reports have followed, including the analysis of trade and connectivity in South Asia, the report entitled A Glass Half Full, which built on that conclusion and also made reference to the fact that you need an organizing multilateral framework for achieving the outcomes. In fact, if South Asia were to have an integrated system for managing trade and connectivity, they would achieve a 15-fold output in terms of GDP, but they would also have a mechanism for managing the environmental impacts that trade has on the region. More recently, the 2020 World Development Report on Global Value Chains tracked and made reference to the changes in global value chains that exist. So, in order to decarbonize freight transport in emerging economies, interventions must be made at the operational level, at the sector level, at the level of countries, and at the level of regions. And these have to be aligned with the wider political and environmental and developmental aspirations of these countries. And this is a key point in this whole agenda of decarbonizing transport. In any discussion on the impact that developing countries are having on freight transport, it is impossible to conclude or come to any reasonable outcomes without discussing the two largest and fastest growing emerging economies, that is India and China. And what we see from the trend maps, the trend graphs that are shown here, is that from the time when the economies of India and China from the mid to late 1990s grew rapidly, the emissions, CO2 emissions from these countries also increased remarkably. And given that between India and China, there is about a third of the world's population, there is no credible discussion of decarbonizing transport that you can have without taking into account what is happening in India and China. And to add to this is the impact that the latest COVID-19 pandemic has had. The most recent complete data that we have from China shows that while at the height of the lockdown and the impact of the pandemic, the general trend was towards less freight intensity. What has happened since then is that more and more freight is now moved by road. Before the pandemic, already 80% of the freight transport in China was supported or buttressed by a highly fragmented freight fleet of trucks. Now, after the pandemic, more and more freight is being moved by road, and also individual travel, both for delivery of parcels and delivery of items, is increasingly being taken by road freight. And so it raises questions around how to decarbonize transport in a post-COVID-19 world. Thankfully, a lot of efforts have been made and a trend set from the commitments made at the European level to have zero emissions in logistics by 2050. But encouragingly, on the 27th of September, President Xi Jinping made a commitment for China to be carbon neutral by 2060, and which, if you go by the previous commitments that the government of China has made, we have some hope that these things will happen. But the question is, besides China, what will happen in countries like India? And what about other large population, fast-growing emerging economies such as Malaysia, Indonesia, Nigeria? Will these countries also follow through on tangible ways in which to decarbonize transport? Some of the strategies that would work in developing countries would require significant changes in behavior and in the political economy of these countries. And so this then raises a number of questions around what opportunities exist. And I would like to tackle three specific opportunities that I see for developing countries as they think about strategies for decarbonizing transport. The first is that for many emerging economies, for some emerging economies, the core infrastructure has basically been built. The road, rail, inland waterways infrastructure in China, for instance, is more or less complete. The challenge then is to integrate it in a manner that supports a rapid reduction in emissions from the transport sector. But for many emerging economies, the bulk of the core physical infrastructure has not yet been constructed. This means that there is an opportunity to configure the transport network in a way that supports a rapid reduction in emissions and rapidly decarbonizes the transport sectors in these countries. This is possible if there are the right multilateral institutions that are fit for the future, both regional and international. The second big opportunity that exists to drive the decarbonizing agenda is the digital networks that could be configured in a way that they support this new drive for transportation systems that are smart, that are seamless, and that require that minimize the impact that physical movement of goods from one part of the production chain to the other can be built. The third is the advantage that has come from the green energy revolution. the future networks in countries such as Uganda or Nigeria or Nicaragua, Brazil, could be networks that are highly efficient in terms of their use of energy and the way that they are built. And finally, but perhaps not to be minimized, is the impact that sustainable financing will have on driving low carbon transport in a post-pandemic world. Starting from 2008, many of the large institutional investors have become much more sensitive to where the investments go. In 2008, a number of Scandinavian pension funds and banks approached the World Bank, and working together with the World Bank came up with the green bonds, which were opportunities for investors whose shareholders were sensitive to the requirements that the investments go towards investments that target environmentally friendly, socially acceptable, and economically sustainable investments. This trend has led to an increase in the so-called green bonds from $11 billion in 2008 to now an industry that is more than $330 billion. And many institutional investors are looking to sustainable avenues for financing infrastructure, but by extension, all the avenues for decarbonizing freight. So the question then is, with these four big opportunities to drive the decarbonizing agenda in developing countries, what else is needed? I conclude by making reference to three important ingredients that I see. The first is a need for multilateral coalitions that would support and provide a safe space for policy champions who want to take forward an agenda that leads to a much greener, decarbonized freight sector for their countries. These multilateral coalitions would enable and provide a nudging effect on the other countries and the policymakers. Second is, not to be underestimated, is the role of the financing sector. The projects of the future, the projects that are green, will be extremely complex in nature. And if the financing instruments are embedded from project initiation, then it is likely that all the rest of the chain, from the policy makers through to the supply chain, will more or less be aligned. This will be the mechanism for exploring opportunities for green fuel, for green networks, for model shift that is sensitive to the requirements of a decarbonized freight transport sector. And the third is this concept of synchronizing policy instruments. That means that not only should financing be green, but also tax incentives, subsidies, and all other policy instruments that in concert could lead to a green future. So these are some thoughts that I have, and I think that the future for decarbonizing freight transport could be bright, because we're in a very, very momentous time when, with the right decisions, the right policies in place, the future for decarbonization of freight transport could be very bright. And so I sincerely look forward to some of the deliberations that will be had throughout the rest of this conference, and remain open to suggestions and any questions that will arise. Thank you very much.